Welcome back to Propaganda Loves You. This is our part 2 episode of our interview with Vince Fakhoury Horn from the Buddhist Geeks podcast and organization. This episode picks up right where the first episode of the week that we dropped on Tuesday left off. So I would say it would make most sense to listen to that episode. Otherwise, you might be a little bit lost in the context of this one. That's the only information I want to provide for the introduction. Otherwise, here is the second portion of that conversation with Vince. Enjoy the show.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I feel like in organizer spaces, the kind of practical approach to that has been mutual aid. Has been
Right.
trying to build mutual aid. And even
Yes.
like we've talked a lot about general strike strategies on the show before, and how a precursor to a successful general strike has to be robust mutual aid networks that can support communities
Right.
when the systems are intentionally shut down.
Right.
What do you think about this concept of mutual aid, and how do you
Yeah.
see that connecting to the work you do?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I live, as I said, in Western North Carolina, and last year or year before last, we went through Hurricane Helene, one of the biggest hurricanes to hit this region ever. And, we were out of power for a month after, and we didn't have running water for 3 months after. And it was immediate, and as is always the case when these natural disasters happen, that this sort of bottom-up community of mutual aid just sort of arises. Suddenly the local library in our neighborhood became like the aid distribution center. All of my neighbors are sort of like volunteering their time and effort. And there's this amazing upswelling of mutual aid that arises because the infrastructure, the modern infrastructure, isn't literally not functioning anymore. And I see that and I go, okay, that's great. But then the infrastructure gets patched back up. And what happens? It's like for the most part, we go back to living as atomized consumers who don't really talk much to our neighbors. And we kind of live in a sort of isolated and lonely way. I see the work that I'm doing, especially with social practice, to be a kind of attempt to kind of restitch together those human connections. At first with strangers, but then realizing, oh, well, like it's weird that I can have this profound experience of like unitive connection with people that I don't even know. And yet, like for my own family and neighbors, I don't feel this way, and I actually want people to feel the kind of weirdness of that and to sort of say, well, why is it so wrong that I can have this kind of experience with someone that I don't even know that feels so intimate and so connected. And I'm not having that with my own like children or partners or friends or neighbors. And so that's been the kind of direction I guess I've mostly been kind of exploring this, but it's also, something we explore in the context of community. It's like, what does it mean to be a community of practice? We're getting together and doing these things and say coming on retreat once in a while together, being in person, developing that sense of being in the room with each other, community. Because that experience of genuine community, like you're saying, that is the basis for mutual aid. It's so natural. It's like once you're connected to someone, you want to help them if they're going through something difficult. It's not like you have to sign up for a service to do that. It's like an obvious thing. How does that land?
That lands great with me. Yeah, definitely resonate very well. Yeah, I just want to keep giving Arthur a chance to jump in. If anything's on your mind, I don't want to colonize the questions.
Y'all are talking about how there's a shift from maybe like individualism to more of community-based practices here. And it sounds like a real tool that is super useful in relating some of these concepts is how, Vince, you talked about like going from the I to like the second, where it's become the object, and you can go to this other voice and maybe relate. And I'm curious if you think that involves a level of like empathy to it, or like is empathy a necessary component, I guess, to this practice?
Absolutely. Yeah, and empathy on multiple levels. Like there's There's cognitive empathy, where you can take the perspective of another, but there's also emotional empathy. And then there's somatic empathy. At the very least, we have all of those capacities, like we can feel into what someone else is experiencing. And some people are better at some of those than others. Like I'm much better at cognitive empathy than the others, and I thus have to train these other ones more rigorously. But yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what we're directly training in practice often is the ability to, and especially with social meditation practice, is the ability to be open to not only our own experience, but the experience of others, and to actually in some way practice without collapsing into either. What I found after leading a lot of trainings on social meditation, teaching people how to facilitate these practices and share them with others, is that some people tend to be more self-focused and others tend to be more other-focused. And for the people that are self-focused, what will happen is they'll tend to lose others in themselves. And for people that are other-focused, they'll tend to lose themselves in others. And to me, the real liberating potential here is when you neither lose yourself nor others, when you stay connected to your own experience and the importance of what you need, and at the same time do the same with others, so that you're not kind of collapsing into either side of the street.
Yeah,
great in theory, hard in practice, of course.
Yeah, definitely. I think I tend to go with the others, so that's really
you tend to be more other
interesting
focused. Yeah.
Very empathetic. I was like vegetarian at age like 10, and I've basically been like, vegan since, and
Right.
I just all high empathy and values. And I think totally it can tend to disappear into the state of like others and thinking about that empathy rather than the self. And so balancing that and striking that is really interesting. Something I should definitely take into practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I'm more of a self-focused personality, so it's really been opening to others and considering others and holding others in my mind and heart that have been it's been transformative for me. Yeah.
There are all these dualities that we could kind of point to, or maybe duality isn't the correct concept. Maybe it's more of a binary, but a big one that I'm thinking of is the difference between an experience and an abstraction. The experience of a thing versus a thought about a thing.
Right.
And sort of a point of confusion, perhaps, especially for a general audience when we're talking about Buddhist practices of meditation. What is awakening as an experience and as an abstraction, right? How can we sort of narrate that difference between thinking about awakening versus an experience of awakening? I know it's kind of an impossible thing to use language to describe, actually. That's kind of the problem with it.
Yeah, and it's impossible not to as well. So
yeah, just for a general audience, how do you unpack that? Like, what is awakening? How do you stop thinking about it and try to practice it, or vice versa? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, okay, this is important. So, so from a Buddhist meditative or contemplative frame, one concept that's really helpful here, and again, like I'm going to start with concepts, right, to explore this, which is the ironic fun part of this, which is the concept of perception. So in terms of human perception, what is perception? I'll use a definition from a Tibetan Buddhist teacher named Lama Lena. She says, when a sensation is interpreted, that's a perception. So sensation here meaning like seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting. And actually, from the Buddhist point of view, thinking is also a sensation. They consider that the sixth sense. But thinking is a special kind of sense because it's a sort of internal representation of the other five senses. We internally represent those external senses back to ourself, and then we relate to things from the point of view of that internal representation or abstraction. We're abstracting from what's happening and thinking about it. And yet those thoughts arise in our experience in the same way that everything else does. So they're, in fact, part of experience. And so we can't turn them off. And that's the understanding within the Buddhist frame, is that you can't turn, you can for temporary periods, like maybe in certain altered states, they subside, but they always come back online, and we always then have to make sense of our experience. So perception is the sense-making capacity. And so how I think about this in terms of like training folks is most people come in and they're not able to make that distinction because they're so caught and embedded in their perceptual frameworks, in their concepts and beliefs about what's happening. They don't see that as something that comes and goes or changes. They see it as the truth. And then they're just looking at reality from the point of view of these truths. And so the real challenge there is to help people see that what they think is true are actually constructs. They're conceptual frameworks and beliefs and perceptions that shape how they're making sense of reality. And that includes the concept of the self. That's a big thing that Buddhism tries to really kind of question. It's like, well, tell me, where is this self? You know, can you point to it in your experience? It's like, oh, it's like kind of behind my eyes, I guess, and a little back here. And it's like, okay, so it's like the homunculus in the back of your head or whatever is the self. And there's like, okay, well, like look for those sensations and see what happens to them when you look. And it's like, well, like it vanishes. I don't know where I am now. Well, maybe I'm like the image of myself that arises. I'm like, yeah, but the image comes and goes. Like you're not always imagining yourself. Sometimes you're just like, you know, drinking a cup of water and you're not even, you know, concerned about anything but just the sensation of cool water touching your tongue. And in those moments, where's the self? You know, where are you? So for me, there's a whole process of kind of being able to move down the ladder of inference or the ladder of abstraction to be able to kind of disembed from concepts and become more aware of the underlying sensory phenomena that, in a sense, kind of compound together to form these sort of almost like illusions of higher order stuff that's happening. You know, in the similar way that when you kind of see a mirage in the desert, it's like the mirage isn't there in actual terms. It's just a function of where you're located and the environmental conditions and that particular constellation coming together in just the right way that looks like there's something there. But then, you know, you investigate further and you see there's no there. That's what the idea of emptiness means in the Buddhist frame, is that when you look close enough, there's no fundamental there as in terms of an independent thing that you can point to as the thing that's always there. Everything is interdependently arising. It's based on causes and conditions, including the sense of the one who's looking. The looker, the watcher, is part of the matrix of what's arising and passing. And so once people see that, it sort of leads to a very liberated sense of perception. Not that you stop thinking in conceptual terms, but then now you have access to something, to a layer of experiential understanding that is right where concepts are arising. I remember I was on a long retreat in my early years of practice, and I got to this point in my practice where I was still enough and calm enough that I was noticing what I would now call like the intention to think, the bubbling up of the moment of about to think. Before the even thought arose, it was almost like a bubbling up in awareness. And then the moment of noticing it, the about to think bubble would pop and no thought would arise. And I was just sitting there for like days watching thoughts like almost arise and then pop. And it's like, well, shit, if I can be aware of this level of experience, then maybe if I just stay here, I will be free. Because it seems like where we really suffer is when we're up here in the thoughts, you know, and we're arguing and fighting about ideologies, etc. But it turns out that that's a story too. You know, the idea that you could be free of stories is itself a new perceptual story, you know, a new way we start to engage. And the non-dual teachings that I mentioned earlier, like nirvana and samsara are one, thinking and sensations are all part of the field of what's happening. So you don't need to get rid of thoughts. In fact, if you try to get rid of them, you're just thinking about not thinking, which is like just perpetuating thinking. So that's obviously not going to work. But to me, the real liberation comes from when you can just deconstruct concepts and abstractions, but then when you can reconstruct them in a more free and liberated way, you know, where you can start to kind of, instead of be used by concepts, you can start to kind of artfully play, you know, with ideas and, you know, see them as having liberating potential without necessarily getting attached or ossifying, calcifying around concepts as much, which again is itself a concept, non-attachment, So I don't even take that too seriously. Is that even possible? I don't know. Maybe not.
Yeah, it kind of just reminded me of the whole raft metaphor that you need some tool to get across the flood of suffering to some new liberating perspective.
Yes.
The skillful construction of a self in order to arrive at a different point of view.
Like the
I kind of relate when I start thinking about stuff like this. It always makes me think about internal family systems as a technique that I've found helpful, just in terms of dealing with your own psychological shit, just noticing your different parts and sort of relating to them skillfully as constructed selves that appear and disappear. Yeah, trying to form it as a question that makes sense.
You don't have to. You can
I
also share a statement. I'm fine.
Okay. I guess I'm just trying to think through this process of what in Buddhist terms is called becoming, what that means, and how to do it with mindful intention. How do you work with, like you're kind of pointing to, with playfully engaging with this process that's always going on rather than just allowing it to unfold habitually and mindlessly?
Yes.
When you're mindfully and intentionally engaging in the process of becoming over and over and over again in different ways,
Yeah.
how do you kind of, as a teacher, I guess, how do you explain that to students who are trying to work with that?
It's very hard because words aren't sufficient. As you know, like two people can be saying the same thing and totally not be communicating the same thing. In fact, that often happens when people get into Buddhism and they read a bunch of books and then they start, they become kind of evangelical, right? Like, which is a normal part of any kind of on ramp to an ideology. And it's embarrassing as well in Buddhism because it's sort of antithetical to the point. But nonetheless, people do this, and you'll hear someone talking and about compassion, and you're like, oh my God, they're so full of shit. And then you can hear someone else saying the same thing, and it's obvious that there's like they're embodying what they're saying. And in the Zen tradition, they actually have a way of describing this that I think is kind of cool. They talk about the difference between live words and dead words. And dead words are like when you're saying something and you're full of shit and you don't really understand what you're talking about. You're trying to perform wisdom. Whereas live words are obviously coming from a wise place. Like you can't deny it because you feel it in yourself and you resonate with it and it calls you deeper. It's an embodied, quote unquote, transmission would be the Buddhist terminology for this. Like you actually transmit a way of being that resonates beyond words. And thank goodness this is possible, because otherwise, how would dancers and potters and other, people who transmit and cultivate this amazing capacities and then share them with the world, how else would they be able to do that, since those disciplines don't involve or include words? So I think that's the real challenge, is how to actually embody and integrate the reality of these things such that when you talk about them, people feel them. And it's not just a concept, it's not just a theory. And that's a much longer and more difficult process than simply learning the right conceptual framework.
It makes me think about integration as, you kind of talk about different axes of development, and I've been just fascinated to listen to a lot of your talks about the different ways to approach development. And I think this notion of integration is really, really important. And it applies to meditation practice, of course, but I think it applies to anyone who's trying to learn more about the world and then find useful ways to incorporate what they've learned into daily practice, whatever that means for them.
Right.
Can you speak to this concept of integration? Like, how do you approach it as a teacher? And do you see in the meditation community, do you see this as another point of contention where you're trying to do something that's lacking in the community when it comes to integration?
Yes, I'm remembering here, as in response to this question, there's an event that I was invited to participate in. There's a YouTube, you could link to it if people want to see. We were exploring psychedelics, technology, and meditation in a community called the Consciousness Hacking Community in San Francisco. And this was more than 10 years ago around. And my friend Mikey Siegel, who'd started this project, Conscious Hacking, invited myself and another Buddhist teacher named Michael Taft to sort of do this live dialogue. To my shock, there were like 600 people, in the audience. It ended up hitting a nerve at that time in San Francisco. And one thing that Michael Taft shared, which I thought was so funny and so accurate, he said, to him, he said, I'm not that impressed with the idea of a quote unquote enlightenment button. The idea that you could just click a button and be enlightened, because like in some sense, psychedelics already are that in a way. They give you a temporary experience. If you take a high dose of psilocybin or LSD, good luck not experiencing awakenings. But then what, then what? That's really where the challenge comes. It's like some people lose their shit entirely in response to those experiences. You can actually, lose touch with conventional reality, and you can have a complete break. I did actually experience this, even though I was a long-term meditator when I was 30, 12 years ago. I took psilocybin for the first time. Actually, I did 4 journeys over the course of about a month, leading up to a conference that I was hosting with 300 people. Not the greatest idea, it turns out in retrospect. But on the 4th trip, I took like a progressively higher dose each time, and I had the experience of psychosis for multiple days, where I was moving in and out of not being able to be in touch with consensual reality. Like I'd lost the ability for periods of time to know who I was and what was happening, and not in the way that I'd experienced with Buddhist awakening states, but in a way where I lost the ability. It wasn't just I was aware that this was a social construct. It was like, oh no, I can't find my way back to Vince, And so I think these experiences of psychosis are real, and we actually really need to be focused on what a positive transformation looks like out of these conventional realities versus, kind of what it looks like to lose touch with conventional reality and regress. And this is maybe not talked enough about, because integration is about being able to take what has previously emerged and make sense of it within a higher order understanding. It's not about the breaking down and losing those capacities. We don't want to lose the capacity to use concepts and to know who is being referred to when the name Joe or Arthur or Vince, is said. We want to be able to continue to function in the world of conventional reality, but in a heightened and more liberated way. And heightened, I don't mean like better, because sometimes it is better, but sometimes it actually takes quite a while usually to get better after we sort of wake up from. A lot of times we'll just stop caring about certain things once we awaken to how empty they are. Like, it's like, who cares about achieving so much when you realize that, like, no matter how much you achieve, it's not going to make you fundamentally okay. Like, once you realize that, you might stop caring as much about achievement. And that's okay. That actually might mean there's something deeper that's possible. You also asked the question about how do I do that as a teacher? That's another issue.
Because I feel like I'm in and out of that kind of phase with my practice sometimes. Like I've had a handful of experiences that have really just kind of shocked my conventional view of reality.
Right.
And then I've felt just kind of adrift and unresourced, I guess, as a practitioner when it comes to that, what next? Okay, how do I integrate this realization I feel like I've had into my daily life? Because there are plenty of days where it feels like what you're saying, like, what's the point?
Yeah.
Why do anything when it's all empty? And it's just a silly story I'm telling to myself.
Right. Exactly.
And how, what are the practices, I guess, you recommend for someone who's kind of in a disillusioned phase?
Yeah.
And trying to find that meaning-making capacity that feels skillful and alive and useful to what feels necessary for people in the moment.
So when people are really going through a phase of disillusionment, and that word is useful here because, it points to the way out. It's like a disillusionment is when you see through an illusion, you see through something that wasn't true. And of course, the natural response is to grieve. Like when we see through the illusion of the solid sense of self, or through the idea that, like, if we make enough money, then we'll finally be happy, or any of those sort of delusions that people often walk around with in our culture and society, then it's like, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, I've just lost something that even though I see that I don't want to operate from there anymore, it's been such an integral part of who I am up to this point that I have to kind of grieve the loss of that identity in a way. And, to grieve properly, I think you have to let yourself fully feel the reality of that disillusionment instead of, and this is the common mistake that people will almost always make, instead of try to go back to the high that you experienced that sort of showed you, like where the veils were lifted and you heard the voice of God and everything, blew up into consciousness or whatever, however the experience was. It's like, people want to go back there because that seems so much better. But actually we're dealing with the ramifications of that experience on our life. And we're trying to come into like, to living with that reality. So to me, it's really it's all about unconditional trust. At the end of the day, it's about learning how to let go and trust whatever is here, including grief, anger, disappointment, frustration with it not being the way I want it to be. Like all of the things that seem like earlier in my meditation journey, I was learning how to like not be bothered by. Now I'm there's nowhere I can hide from them. And the real challenge is not hiding, is actually facing those things and being kind of torn asunder by them in a way, to be reconfigured by the grief and the loss. And then on the other end of that, I promise there will come a time where the storm settles and the sky parts and there's some sense of peace on the other end. And in a way, you can't force that to happen. You actually just have to trust the process without expectation of it getting better, which is the ironic part. Easier said again than done.
Yeah, again with the paradoxical practices, it's breaking through some paradoxes.
Yeah,
it feels impossible, but it's I don't know, it's just part of the terrain.
Yeah, it isn't impossible since so many people throughout time have done it. That's why traditions can be helpful, source of inspiration.
Arthur, you got anything that's bubbling up for you right
evoking
now?
a lot of rumination, and it's really good. No, I was just thinking about like how it all connects to the philosophy I've read of stuff, and like, how you have to create is to like first, different philosophical camps, but to create is first can be like an act of, you have to destroy, and like destroying can be a real, it's like disillusionment. It can really, you have to break them down. And I love the fact that when you come back around, you embrace them and you live, and you acknowledge like this reality that you live with and these paradigms and contexts. And I love that. So I think that all just adds to actually looking at life through a real lens of like, quote unquote truth, with maybe not a capital T there, and really like, just giving way to dealing with the reality of the context that we live in. And so I love those kind of heuristic tools, I guess, to be able to, and obviously it's more than that, but these like, heuristical tools to be able to empathize or see the world or deal with it in a way that is sans illusions in some way. So I love, all of this. And it's really, you've really widened my, view of Buddhism and meditation, I think, in general here, and some of the biases that I had and the ideas that I had of it versus like where it is and what it is. So it's lovely. Yeah.
Well, your ideas are probably right, but they probably only apply to like a subsection of the Buddhist world. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm right. I actually agree with all of the things you mentioned earlier.
Sure. But I know this tiny little sliver over here that actually doesn't, but it's like floating without context, and you've added the context and given, the tools. So that's great.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. What you and Arthur were just saying reminded me of this metaphor. I don't know where I got this from. I feel like I had to have read it somewhere. I don't think I made it up, but I described it as like a disco ball, a disco ball with a million little individual mirrors on it. And whatever the capital T truth is inside the ball. But in order to see it, you have to look through only one lens at a time. And how that relates to having multiple experiences where you've broken through some illusion to a more essential truth. And then the work of integrating those, what might feel like separate breakthroughs into, I feel like I've heard you talk before about integration as like a expansion and inclusion, like the perspective gets bigger and it includes it more and more over time. And
Right.
how you relate to this idea of inclusion when it comes to integration.
I think this goes back to that thing I shared from Robert Keegan, the subject of one stage becomes the object of the subject of the next, where like you see through one illusion and then interestingly step into a bigger illusion. And then of course the next thing that'll happen if you continue with the process of kind of investigation is at some point you'll start to see the edges of this new illusion, and then you can kind of disembed yourself from that illusion only to re-embed yourself in a new illusion, because there's no space outside of reality from which you can have a kind of privileged point of view. And I think that's maybe that's a parallel, right, with a lot of emerging kind of best political philosophy and Buddhist philosophy. It's like there's no God's eye view. There's no place from which you can see things that is not impacted by other things. But I think that doesn't mean we have to kind of collapse into a completely relativistic notion of reality, because we can talk about how, development, as my first mentor, Ken Wilber, described it, as a process of transcending and including what has come before. Or, and this is really, he's like a kind of neo-Hegelian in a sense. Hegel's terminology with this is a negate and preserve. So transcend and include would be the updated version. I like that. So you can transcend something, and then when you do, it doesn't disappear. It's included as an object, and sometimes as a subject when we get hungry or angry, or we regress, we re-identify with those earlier kind of stages or parts. And so we never leave them behind. We always have the inner child, and we always have, the inner asshole and all these parts. And hopefully we're just not like embedded in them as much as we were. So yeah, I see development in those terms of like something that can keep broadening. And here I'm talking about it in individual terms, but we could also widen the frame and talk about it relationally and sort of say, well, like that's what we're doing together. And that's what you're doing here in this community. You guys talking through the, David Graeber's, every chapter of the book. It's like you're doing that, and then you're offering it back out to whoever is listening and interacting with this. And so in reality, we do it as a social process. It's not actually just an individual one.
Before we turn to like social meditation, because I want to give you a chance to kind of unpack that as a practice before we do it together, or to frame it however you want to. I kind of just wanted to maybe, I don't know, I always have the total beginner in mind when it comes to teaching approaches, and especially with meditation, trying to imagine a person with no practice context. How do I explain the practice of meditation just as a general practice? And the two big categories that feel useful to unpack for me as a teacher are insight practices versus concentration practices. Just to sort of help people get their bearings, there are things you can do to concentrate the mind as practices, and then there are these insight practices, which are something else. There's relation there that's important, but there's also distinction that's important. Can you kind of unpack that, like with a general audience in mind? How do you describe those concepts?
This is one of the classic distinctions that early Buddhism makes, and it's really at the heart of the Buddha's awakening. He came up in a tradition that had insanely developed concentration practices, and he trained with multiple teachers to learn how to get into some of these extremely subtle states of what they called meditative absorption. And that's part of what I teach as a teacher, because I think those states are really lovely, and sometimes they're a lot better than getting into altered states in other ways. They're a lot easier on the body, and etc. And they can be quite healing. There's something that can be very healing just by being in a state of bliss for a regular time each day, where you're not like stressed. That said, for the Buddha, they were insufficient because they didn't lead to the kind of liberated freedom he was looking for. Because the second the state disappears or dissipates, you exit the meditation, you're back to square one, back to having to deal with all of the, stuff that you don't like about yourself. And so he found that he actually had to do things differently. The way I would describe this in modern terms is like the difference between concentration and insight is a lot like the difference between, say, taking like a telescope or a microscope, something that's meant to extend your view in either direction. And with concentration, what you're doing is equivalent to polishing the lens on the telescope. Like if you have a dirty lens, it's very hard to make observations through the telescope. So you actually have to polish the lens and make it clear. Most of us have extremely, dirty lenses when it comes to our attentional capacity. We can't stop and stabilize our attention and look clearly at what's happening because our minds are so moving from thing to thing, jumping around. The term monkey mind is often used to describe the quality of this kind of mind that's untrained. Whereas insight practices are like taking that telescope, say, and using it to make cosmological observations like Galileo did. First the telescope had to exist. He had to polish the lens before he could make those observations. Once you have the capacity to have a stable mind, you can stop and look. This is a great, simple way of talking about the difference between these: stopping and looking. Concentration is stopping, insight is looking. That's as simple as I can describe it. And you have to be able to do both because you can't really be moving rapidly and making clear, precise observations.
Yeah, and so it's like a scaffolding kind of. What would you recommend for a new meditator who wants to develop these dual axes of practice of polishing the lens and also looking in a meaningful way? What's a sort of basic practice you would describe for a new meditator to start a little bit of concentration practice, but also regularly stopping to look?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the classical formulation is to first develop some concentration, like a sufficient amount that you can look and see something new. It varies in terms of, it's hard for me to recommend any specific technique here because there's so many ways you can do that. And a lot of it will depend on on you and your kind of natural proclivities and what comes easy for you. So I'd say finding something to focus on as a kind of meditation object that you can be with that doesn't feel boring. The breath is the most classic example, but for a lot of people, the breath is a problematic thing to focus on because the second one starts breathing, they might start feeling anxious actually when they pay attention to their breath. That was true for me. For other people, counting can be helpful. Like you breathe and count the breath. For me, if I were to go back and sort of redo things, I think I would have started with just a simple visual circle, like a visual object. Because I realize now, like I'm pretty visual in terms of processing. I think a lot of people are. And just looking at a visual orb and just bringing your attention back to the orb every time it starts to fragment or wander, it's returning back to this sort of seeing this circle. But it could be something else. You could actually do it with basic positive wishing. You can make that your object. You could say, may love arise. And you could just keep repeating that, may love arise. And here the idea is like you're wishing for love to arise, not just for yourself, but for everyone. And you kind of have this kind of wish for love to be present, or compassion, or joy, or safety, or whatever it is that you're wishing well. Sometimes people can get so absorbed in and connected to that feeling of like open-hearted care, and that comes easy to them. So it's a question of finding which object works for you. I think that's the first step. It's like, kind of like the sorting hat in Harry Potter. You got to figure out which house you belong to. And then once you know that, you're going to get traction. Because if you pick the wrong thing to focus on, you won't get traction. And then you'll think, oh, this meditation thing doesn't work. Well, yeah, it does work. But it works only if you find a suitable practice. Now, that's the classical formulation. I'm more of the internet generation like you all. I think hyper-individualistic meditation works for some people, but not for others. And so I think starting with a social meditation practice is good because then you get the benefit of social pressure. It's much harder to wander when you're like doing a social exercise and you're accountable for like showing up and like doing something, in some turn-based order or whatever. And if you don't do it or you do it incorrectly, your friends are going to judge you. Just take advantage of the fact that we're social primates, and that can be quite helpful because I find people get some early traction doing those kind of practices and experience, to their surprise, deep concentration states from very little amount of practice. And that can be hugely empowering, to have that experience early on, which I hope we're going to do here together, because I want to prove it, not just claim it.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, last chunk of time here with you, I really just want to encourage you to use it however you want. But yeah, let's explore some of the social meditation practice that you've been talking about.
Yeah, sounds great. I mean, this would be a great place to end. And one thing I would say is, like, for those that are watching or listening, you're invited into this practice in a very special way, which is you're invited to witness it, to watch it. And that isn't actually, as we've kind of been talking about, that isn't some position that is apart from what's happening. By watching people meditate out loud, you actually will notice something. And so the invitation for you is to notice what you notice, just see what it's like for you. What I will share with you is a practice that I mentioned earlier, the there is noting, where you use the phrase there is, and then it's followed by a word or two that describes anything that you're noticing in your sensory experience, anything. Literally, you're free to pick what those words are. We're only using a word or two because we want to keep it simple, and we don't want to get into the trap of starting to kind of fall up the ladder and fall into our abstractions. We're training the ability here to kind of stay with a very simple, basic present moment experience. Mindfulness, as you're trained in, Joe. And so the instructions are quite simple. We'll take turns saying there is, and then using a word or two to describe whatever we notice. You can also, when it's your turn, if you don't know what's happening, you can just say, there is not knowing, or pass, or don't know, or thank you. Any variation on that theme is fine. This is important because, if you think you have to come up with the right answer, you could start getting socially anxious, pretty quickly spiral out into a panic attack. So we give ourselves a way out here in social meditation. It's always fine to say you don't know. And then the last thing I would say is, like, when I do these practices with others, I always invite people into a silent observer or witnessing position if they want to participate that way. So say, Arthur, if you want to watch Joe and I do this, you could totally do that. You don't have to participate out loud if you don't feel moved to. And that's important for preserving our agency in practice. Too often when teachers guide meditations, they take basically an authoritarian broadcast one-to-many position. And they sort of just say, okay, these are the instructions, follow me. Here, this is like the internet of meditation. This is a peer-to-peer practice. I'm describing the practice to you. I'm facilitating the practice, but I'm going to just do it with you. I'm not a privileged person where I have all the experience. Like, you all are noticing what you're noticing too, not just what I want you to notice. So yeah, those are the basic instructions. How does 5 minutes sound?
Sounds good to me.
Any fun on how to do it?
Before I heard you describe the practice, maybe there's not enough time to go through the layers, but there's it starts with an ordered there is, and then eventually you drop the phrase, right? And then eventually you drop the order. I don't know if you're interested in doing that progression, but that's just something I wanted to ask about.
Yeah, that's another technique called progressive release noting. It's a slightly more intermediate practice. So usually when I start with pure beginners, we'll start with there is. Kenneth did that. He said because he could teach someone how to meditate in 2 minutes at the bar. It takes very little time to explain how to do this. But we could absolutely talk about it if you want to kind of explore some more sort of more advanced practice. That sequence is a little bit more, I think it would require a little bit of kind of foundational experience first to build up into.
Let's focus on the
beginner. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, great. So we'll do 5 minutes. I'll keep track of the time unless you want to, Joe. I'm fine either way.
Go for it.
Okay. All right.
There is breathing.
There is attuning.
There is low back stiffness.
There is relaxation.
There is relating.
There is deep breathing.
There's pressure.
There is sensation.
There is appreciation.
There is listening.
There is breathing.
There is warmth.
There is sitting.
There is relaxing.
There is settling.
There is coolness.
There is floating, gathering.
There is collecting attention.
There is fidgeting.
There is fading.
There is heart beating.
There is pressure.
There is tightness.
There is searching.
There is openness.
Bombing.
There's releasing tension.
There is remembering and letting go.
There is focus.
There is release.
There is attunement.
There is concentrating.
There is concentration.
There is concentration.
There is searching.
There is releasing downward.
There is rhythm.
There is interpreting.
There is relating.
There is feeling into gravity.
There is projecting.
There's adjusting posture.
There's seeing.
There is grounding thoughts.
There is recognizing.
There is lightness.
There is hopefulness.
There is aliveness.
There is spaciousness.
There is appreciation.
There is mutuality.
There is community.
There is insight.
Got to end there. That's the stop. That's it. That's the practice.
That's really interesting. Really interesting to hear how y'all go about that and how it's just, I don't want to say like it was like, a ladder going up, because for me, it kind of jumped, but it's just really interesting to verbalize that. and to see how it came about.
It's a new practice for me too. Like I've done a couple of exercises and training groups and stuff before, but social meditation is not something I have much experience with at all. So for me, what came up, especially there towards the end, is I don't know, I kind of noticed my body was rocking a little bit while we were going, and it kind of felt like a momentum of mutuality building over time. Like you can kind of sense into how the way that we were attuned to each other and sort of cycling through, it just sort of felt like a snowball gradually picking up speed.
If that had gone on for like
Yeah.
30 minutes, it would have been like, yeah, definitely. Would we have all been like just attuned to each other and the community there?
Yeah, we did a microdose here. You can imagine upping the dosage and you get psychedelic effects at higher doses, in fact. And we've done these practices on long meditation retreats where we'll do, multiple hours a day of this. And then between times just be in silence meditating, and it can get quite powerful. Lots of insights can arise, and it can be very trippy, which is a positive thing if you're looking for like a high without as much of a, of a downer after. A little easier on the liver and the lungs and stuff. Although I'm a big fan of cannabis, I'm also like these practices as well.
It's been such an awesome conversation, Vince. I really appreciate your time here today. Just in these last couple of moments, any thoughts on your mind that you want to share as a way of closing?
Yeah, no, just appreciate being invited by you all to explore this together. I hope this is useful for people that are listening.
Thank you. Arthur, is there anything on your mind when we wrap up?
Thanks. Thank you for exposing me and my knowledge and widening it even more. And I learned a lot, and really glad we got to explore all this with you. And it was a really thoughtful conversation. And yeah, just thanks for the time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Well, that's our time for today, folks. Thanks so much, Vince, for joining us today. Wish you all the best in future endeavors, all your entrepreneurial pursuits, your gardening, your family,
Thank you.
everything in general. Yeah.
Likewise.
May you be well.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time.
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.